Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Perez, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Cultural Competency, Engaging Racial and Ethnic Minorities in Prevention Education. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the Q&A panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the Q&A panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options will be posted in the chat panel too. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 10 business days. To access the recording, go to www.fada.org. Also, a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to participants within a similar time frame. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FADA website. You will first need to register or sign in to your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADA as part of the registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 10 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credit or to access your statement of credit. Do note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Monday, March 11th. 1 to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license numbers for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside the state of Florida, you don't need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Note, please, that WebEx monitors arrival and departure of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance. If you do not attend the entire webinar, we are not permitted to provide partial credit. I would like to introduce Jerel. Ezell is a program implementation specialist and community-based researcher located in Chicago, Illinois. He is currently serving at the University of Chicago Department of Medicine where he is coordinating a multi-site study funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which addresses opioid usage and harm reduction programming in Southern Illinois. Jerel holds a Master of Public Health, MPH, from Columbia University and is a current doctoral student in sociology at the University of Chicago. Prior to moving to Chicago, Jerel worked at the New York State Psychiatric Institute Center of Excellence for Cultural Competence, where he implemented and evaluated preventative lifestyle interventions for primarily low-income Hispanic and Black individuals. To date, Jerel has served as a researcher and a program evaluator on over 10 SAMHSA and NIH-funded grants addressing health disparities, psychological trauma and stigma. In addition, he has published and contributed to multiple peer-reviewed articles on the health and well-being of racial and ethnic minorities with mental illness and comorbid substance use and/or chronic conditions. Jerel's work has appeared in the Root, Ethnicity and Disease, Community Mental Health Journal, and the Journal of Child and Adolescent Trauma. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter, Jerel Ezell. I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane, for that introduction. Again, my name is Jerel Ezell, and I have a few different titles. These days, I'm going with medical sociologist because I'm affiliated with the Department of Sociology. But also, I am an instructor at the University of Chicago. So today we're going to be talking about cultural sensitivity. I think right off the bat, that's probably a little distinctive from the original marketing that was done for this webinar. And I'm going to explain that distinction. Hopefully you noted that. If you did, I'm glad. If not, then this is definitely a great opportunity to get into the distinctions between cultural sensitivity and cultural competence. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I don't see any comments right now saying otherwise. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this. And I apologize if there's a slight delay between me speaking and the slides actually showing up here. Okay, so traditionally when I give talks, I like to give a little bit of an overarching statement about the sort of the goals and the framework for the discussion. You've probably seen most of this, again, in relation to the marketing for the webinar, but I just want to go through this again. And just a disclaimer right off the bat, this is loaded with buzzwords, and that was sort of my way to get my foot through the door, so I have the opportunity to talk about these issues. But I'm just going to go through this quickly, just to, again, give you sort of the philosophical underpinning for what I want to discuss today. So this webinar seeks to introduce participants to the core definitional and operational dimensions of cultural sensitivity and culturally sensitive programming. And along the way, participants will learn pillars and extensions for successfully defining, creating, implementing, and evaluating culturally sensitive programming for individuals dealing with substance use and mental health conditions. And also, and I have an emphasis here, participants will learn how to sustainably and reflexively engage workforces around cultural sensitivity practices and establishing the organizational and institutional infrastructure needed to maintain an ongoing atmosphere of equity, equality, and understanding for all involved in the care continuum. And through that, I think you probably saw around 10 to 15 different buzzwords, but these are all applicable, and I hope through the end of this talk today, you see how they resonate and how they apply to actual applications in the field and the work that you're doing. So just to give you a few notices before we begin, first I'll note that I have no conflicts of interest to report, and then also want to state that the things that I'm going to talk about today, the opinions that I express, they do not necessarily reflect those of the University of Chicago. So to get into some of the learning objectives that we have today, we have three. The first is, again, just sort of reiterating the roadmap that I laid out, is to define cultural sensitivity in various cultural, social, linguistic, and environmental contexts. And then in addition to that, moving towards the application framework is to talk about successfully devising, applying, and tailoring our cultural sensitivity principles and practices. And then lastly, I want to end with a discussion of how we can effectively and efficiently evaluate and calibrate and tune our practices and interventions at the employee, organization, and individual level. So my goal really is to get you to see cultural competence, which I'm again gonna reframe as sensitivity as more than a buzzword or a passing fad in the field. And being honest here, even introducing this as cultural sensitivity and not cultural competence, this hopefully sets that tone. So I'm sure the thinking among a lot of you, if you're not familiar with this idea of cultural sensitivity, is like now we're calling it cultural sensitivity. So it seems like every few weeks we're changing our definitions, and there seems to be a lot of semantics involved here. So I'm going to try not to get us too bogged down in some of those nuances and just focus on some of the larger context for what we're doing here. So again, I want to get beyond the semantics. And I really want to challenge this idea, which I feel like is really resonant right now about PC culture and millennials and outrage cultures and labels and pronouns and sort of how we balance some of these cultural perspectives within the context of our practices. And ultimately, I really want to focus on what can we do to be logical, compassionate, and most importantly, effective stewards in the work that you're doing. So, with this latter part in mind, I really want to focus on effectiveness, and I want to situate cultural sensitivity as something that is truly evidence based, which is to say that there's a lot of research out there that shows that employing practices like this leads to wonderful benefits and outcomes for individuals in recovery and also for individuals who are taxed with working with this population. So, in my limited time this morning, I want to explain how and why these different dimensions operate. Another thing I want to say, like I've seen cultural competence and cultural sensitivity presentations before, and just in general presentations around racial equity and social equity. And I've done my best to avoid pictures of diverse people holding hands and peace signs and sunshine and smiley emojis and things along those lines. Um, so with that in mind, I want to start with this anecdote, and actually the timing was really good, and for me to produce this. This happened maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, but it's also sort of an unfortunate case. Um, so again, so I was recently having a conversation with a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, who I've known for a few years, who's involved in clinical practice, and she told me about this exchange that she had with one of her coworkers. So neither of these individuals, my friend or the coworker, was black, but their patient was. So my friend is talking to her coworker about this patient, and they're talking about some particular treatment plan. I don't know all the specifics of it. But this patient was in the office at the time, and I'm paraphrasing this next part. But the coworker said to my friend something along the lines of, expressing frustration and saying, "Oh yeah, like she's one of those angry black women." So immediately, obviously, I'm a black man, and I that resonated with me a bit, and I thought to myself, this coworker could have said that the patient was difficult because some are individuals that we work with in recovery and in other aspects of our programming. They can be difficult to work with, and there can often be tension there. No one here, I think, will disagree with that. But this particular person, this coworker, she wanted to focus her criticism specifically on the patient, on something that's a very salient and a very personal trait. This individual's race that more than likely and very likely is an important and intimate characteristic for this person. So I thought more about this exchange between the coworker and my friend, and I thought to myself, from the perspective of my friend, like, what exactly do you do here, and how cut and dry is it? So if you otherwise like this person, this is the first time you've heard this, maybe it's just like a flat out like no, like this is just not something that we can say. It's a little bit harder to dig underneath that layer and say you shouldn't feel this way when it seems like that's something that's potentially deeply embedded in this person. And then I also thought about this in generational terms and in terms of the current political climate that we have and cultural climate that we have. And I'm thinking, if you're on the younger side, if you're, in your early 20s, you're just starting off, you just got your MSW, you might want to call this person out. You might want to drag them on Twitter or flame them on Facebook. And I thought if you're in your late 30s or 40s, you probably don't know what those things that I said just meant. But at any rate, you'd probably be very concerned about a coworker like this. You might want to confront them. You might tell a supervisor. But at any rate, you would sort of engage in this process of determining what's the appropriate way to handle a coworker who holds a perspective like this, which is clearly antagonistic towards um, not just this one patient, but appears to be more generalized to the perspective of maybe Black women in general, this population in general. So then I also thought more broadly about not just this particular patient, but all patients, including individuals in recovery, and thinking if you hold a view like this, that a particular group of people or this type of person has this particular quality, or in this case, lack of, does that really impact your ability to objectively treat and care for patients? Um, and can that practitioner be changed in a context like this? So, what in particular was this coworker picking up on? I think is getting beneath the surface of this. So, what was it about this particular patient that she saw that made her say, this is an instance of a black woman just being angry, and what factors, on the other hand, were associated with this characterization? So, what was potentially this black patient, quote unquote, putting out that would have led this employee to make this pretty dramatic statement about the character and the disposition of this patient. So, what was the experience of that patient historically, even more recently? And also, how many patients did this practitioner need to draw on to create this narrative that Black women are this particular sort of way? And also interesting, just thinking about again the dynamic between the coworker and my friend, that she felt comfortable putting this out there and saying, Black women, of course you get it, Black women are angry in this way. So again, I fell into this sort of this time warp and thinking about this existential struggle that we often have in practice, where we wonder what can we realistically change about ourselves, or what can we change realistically in terms of how we approach people in practice. And this is what's really, I think, what's important to consider, and this is what I've anchored a lot of the discussion on today. How much does what we can't change about ourselves and about our disposition, how much does that negatively impact the people that we treat? So, to offer you a little bit more of a robust roadmap for our discussion today, the first part, again, is really just get into some of the minutia of how we define and identify culturally sensitive practices. And I'm going to get into a brief history of cultural competence. And then also want to talk about the emergence of cultural sensitivity, again, because that's really our framework today. And also this idea of cultural humility, which you may have heard of. Um, the second part, again, is to get into different applications for cultural sensitivity. So, what are the actual tools and approaches that you can apply in practice in substance use and mental health programming? And then again, I want to end with some level of evaluation into how we actually determine the extent to which we're effective in implementing these practices. So this gets into to some of the different facets involved in program evaluation and implementing different assessments and measurements that look at our effectiveness, the effectiveness of the organization, and also the level of satisfaction and clarity that individuals in recovery are receiving or absorbing from these practices that we're implementing. So one thing that would be sort of interesting to do here is to focus on visuals and visualizations, because a lot of what we do on this space is focus on sort of these initial knee-jerk reactions that we have to people who don't quite look like us. So throughout this webinar today, I'm going to present a few paintings or artworks, and I would like you to think about sort of the different social, cultural, and political context behind these paintings. And I actually have a couple polls that are going to be associated with these. So the first one that I have up here is a painting from Diego Velázquez. And this one is called Los Borrachos, which roughly translates to the drunkards or the drunks. So what I would like you to do with this painting is to think about three interesting things that are taking place in the painting, and then it'll also you to think a little bit more about like what might Velasquez, the painter, be saying here. So you'll notice on I think the lower right of your screen there's a Q&A box. So if you just want to take a few minutes, and I'm going to put the painting back up, just to think about these things again. What are three interesting things that are happening in the painting? And again, trying to apply this framework that I've provisionally introduced here. So you may want to focus on things like colors and tones and lighting, symmetry, perspectives, and other nerdy things like that. Um, or you also may just want to think about what's actually happening in the painting, the position of the characters, their relationships to one another, their actions and activities. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes here to again put in some thoughts into that Q&A box, and then I'm going to read off some of these responses here. So please just take a moment to do that. And again, just go wild, be creative, or just rely on the things that just seem naturally intuitive based on your reading of this painting. So we'll take 1 minute for this, and then once I've seen some of your comments, I'll read those off, and then we'll move ahead and talk about the importance of those perceptions. And also, if the Q&A box does not work for you, I believe you can send your responses through the chat box. But again, we'll go ahead and get started here with 1 minute of observation. Okay, great. I'm just looking at some of the comments here, and these are absolutely great. So I'm just gonna read off a few of these. So one comment that I see here is men being seduced to drinking. Um, Another comment from Ella: the focal character's complexion is the lightest, brightest, and he's wearing the least amount of clothing. Billy Thomas says it's a gathering. Sachet, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. One person as the center of attention. This one person is of a lighter skin tone in comparison to others in the painting. All males. Another very interesting comment and observation. Um, Anna Reed, it's interesting that most of the colors are neutral, but the person who is crowning the other individual has red clothing. Michelle Paisley, three interesting things. They seem as if they are from different time periods. They are all men. Some are looking towards us, and some are looking in other directions. And then a comment here from Corinne that's a little more contextual. Lots of warm tone colors. So these are all absolutely great comments, and it's very interesting to see some of the intersections between what you're saying here, and also some of the distinctions and things that you focused on. So I'm going to give you the reading, the official quote unquote reading about this painting. So at the center here, this figure that's referred to as the lighter person. So this is Dionysus, and this is the person who's referred to, not the person, I guess, a god, the Greek god of, among other things, wine that was said to furnish humans with wine to relieve them of their daily sorrows and pains. So I'm showing this painting and asking for your feedback to not just illustrate, one celebrated artist's take on alcohol or wine, but to get you to think about how we all perceive and evaluate the world. And we're going to come back to this later, but I'd like you to take a few seconds just to think, as we wrap up with this slide, about what this painting tells us about identity, cultural influence, subjectivity, and objectivity. So moving on to the first official section that we have here, where we will be identifying and defining culturally sensitive practices. So this first section, again, is going to offer a brief history on cultural competence, and then I'm going to try to segue into the tradition of cultural sensitivity. I'll talk a little bit about cultural humility as well. But the goal, again, with this section is just to generally outline and help us describe general practices in this space. So, in broad strokes, cultural sensitivity attempts to recognize that each individual human sees experiences and also engages other people in the world in different ways. And more broadly, it represents a set of values, and I'm going to emphasize this idea of fluid, which means that we change and evolve, but that it's dynamic, that these are dynamic values and principles that shape how we can try to understand, learn from, engage, and respond to diverse individuals in recovery that we're working with. So again, oftentimes in these conversations, you'll hear about cultural humility and cultural competence. But again, today we're going to focus on cultural sensitivity. So for the purpose of our discussion, we're going to treat these concepts as essentially being the same. There's some out there, some sticklers, some cultural competence snobs who would probably hate that I'm doing that, but again, for our purposes today, I really want to just lay out the broader picture and not get stuck in the minutia. And actually, no, I think this is one of the big frustrations in the field is that we're constantly changing definitions and we engage in this semantic word salad process, and where we're constantly changing the language in clinical applications, but we're typically we're referring to the same general idea of being open to learning about the people that we're working with in the spaces that we're working with them in. So, what do we want to accomplish with cultural sensitivity? I bracket this around two central goals. So, the first is really to advance and push forward a paradigm or philosophy of treatment and prevention that is specifically tailored to the individual in the context of their cultural expectations. And I'm going to talk a lot about cultural expectations as we get a little bit deeper into this. And we're also talking about this process of creating equity and equality between ourselves and the individual in recovery, and this being in the context of evidence-based diagnosis and care. And again, in these conversations about cultural competence, you're hearing about cultural humility and cultural sensitivity. I'm going to try not to conflate these things today, but for the purpose of our discussion, I'm going to treat these as being like different planes with different routes going to the same destination. One way to look at it, this very simple and almost primal visual here of two circles in this interlapping area here between cultural humility and cultural sensitivity. And my argument is that we want to be in this yellow oval. Like this is really our sweet spot. This is where we as practitioners really want to be. And also, I think more broadly, if you look at this in a logical way, humility requires sensitivity. And then on the flip side, I think we can all really say that sensitivity requires humility in return. Again, into some of the definitional aspects of cultural sensitivity, really focuses on three aspects. So there's intentionality, self-reflection, and these restorative approaches that we can ideally leverage to best address diverse individuals in social services and healthcare. So when I say intentionality, I'm referring to this process of being just very deliberate and thoughtful. When I refer to self-reflection, I'm talking about looking inward. And when I talk about being restorative minded, and you've probably heard this in the context of criminal justice typically, but this idea that we need to step away from this punitive and retributive thinking and try not to embed these values around what should be and what ought to be, and just generally avoiding communication that centers around norms. So again, through this process of cultural sensitivity, we're able to work towards creating this balance between ourselves and the individuals that we work with. But importantly, through this effort of trying to establish and create this balance, there are some natural trade-offs that are generated. So to really unpack what we mean when we talk about cultural sensitivity, I think it's important to first consider what culture is. And very broadly speaking, it's a set of beliefs, attitudes, and practices that govern how we interact and approach the world and others in that world. Another idea that I really like to think about when I think of culture, I term it as something that's socially heritable. So something that is often, it sounds a little cliche, but something that is passed down, often from people in our families or from friends. And also, there's this idea that I think that's growing that culture is really bi-directional. So we sort of transmit these ideas of culture and cultural practices between and among other individuals in this back and forth process. But really, culture is this basic, fundamental building block for cultural competence and cultural sensitivity, and it's something that we all have. And I think oftentimes that we'll launch into the practice of cultural sensitivity without unpacking what we really mean about this. So just to follow up on this point, to unpack culture a little bit more, um, culture is really something that's connected and magnified at all levels of demography. And I think one of the limitations, I'm going to talk about some of the criticisms of this older cultural competence paradigm, is that oftentimes when we talk about culture, people think about it almost explicitly in terms of race and ethnicity. So if you're black, you've got these sort of traditions. If you're white Irish, you have these traditions. If you're Dominican, you have these sort of practices and ideals and beliefs. But culture really is much more entrenched in terms of our identity and the different facets and traits that we possess. It really also is very much embedded in how we identify in terms of gender, sexual orientation, religion, education, income, marital status, and where we live, rural, suburban, urban. And also, it's important to note that individuals aren't monolithic, that they can exist and often do exist in more than one culture. And I think for the purpose of our conversation, again, when we're talking about the applications and you're thinking about on a really granular level, what does culture mean? Culture can really be how much salt you put on a burger. It can be what you drink. It can be how you describe how you're feeling and who you describe it to. It can be the brand of vodka that you like and who you drink it with. And again, to this point about the multiplicity of cultures that we often have, individuals often do and most do identify with more than one culture. And oftentimes, and this is particularly relevant for our conversation today, these cultural identities often have tension and they can be in conflict. And when this conflict exists and it comes to surface, this can create or exacerbate existing health issues that individuals may have. So our second poll for the day is for you to reflect a little bit about your culture. So I'm going to just open this up and let you pick the items here that are most salient to you. Um, but I think more generally, it would be great if you thought just broadly about what are things in your culture that are associated with your culture that you love to do, and then thinking on a more intuitive level, why specifically do you love these things? And where did you learn about these things? How did these emerge in your life? And at what point did these emerge in your life? So just to step back, if someone were to ask you to describe your whole culture, how would you go about doing that? What kind of things are important to you? If it's food, is it a certain type? Is it at a certain plate that you have it or that you like to get it from or that you enjoy it with a certain group of people? It's a certain type of preparation or seasoning that you have with it. Or it could be a sport. And when were you first introduced to it? Who introduced you to it? Things along these lines I'd like you to consider. So again, please take a minute or so to think through this. The last part of this was thinking about the context that you participate in, indulge in. I don't think this is critical for our conversation. I just more generally like you to think about the things that really define your culture and the things that pop out as being very salient and resonant with you. So please take a minute again, putting this in the Q&A box or the chat box, and then we'll return to it. And so, again, we have some great comments here that are flooding in. I'm just gonna read off a few of these. I wish actually we had an opportunity to collate and collect all of these and send these out to everybody. But again, if you're looking in the Q&A box or the chat box, and I think you can see most of these comments. But one that pops up right off the bat from Kareem, food and family. Kenneth has some overlap here: religion, food, drink, family, sports. Uh, Sabrina, singing, giving to others of my time, talent, treasures. Aline mentions being originally from Brazil, and being known for beaches, soccer, food, and dancing. Mary talks about the way her family celebrates holidays. Kimberly talking about family gatherings for any event. Could be Christmas, Easter, or just Tuesday. We love to eat. We love each other's companies. And did I mention food? Food is clearly a recurring theme here. I think it looks to be in about 65, 75% of the comments that I'm seeing here. And these are really great. I see belly dancing mentioning as something from Dana, in addition to gardening. Dancing is also mentioned by Jamie, in addition to reading and being in nature. So these are all very salient and relevant things to us, and these are things that I've asked you on the fly. You never met me before. I'm a stranger to you, aside from this bio that you have of me, and you've shared with me things that are really intimately associated with your identity, your cultural identity. So I want to follow up with this here, and I'll just sort of in the interest of time, focus on the first facet of this. So thinking about your cultural beliefs, and this is all going to come together, hopefully. Um, but thinking about some of the guiding beliefs that you have about the people and the world and how they should behave, and I think this was going to be a little bit tougher of an exercise, but I'm very interested to know like what are your guiding beliefs when you step out the door and you think about how you engage people and how people should engage you. So again, if you could take a minute or so here to think about different beliefs or philosophies, if also you want to focus on that, that's fine, about the world and the way that the world should be. We'll take another minute for that. So again, lots of wonderful responses here, and I'm just going to go through a few of them. Being more tolerant and respectful of each other's differences. Sweeting says this. Respect, love, and understanding. Very concise from Kimberly. Julia saying that people should be kind to others, in particular to those that are in need or suffering. Michelle saying, I think people should take the time to be kind to one another. Brittany, mutual respect, compassion, understanding, and empathy. Jamila, treat others how you would like to be treated. That's a very quintessential statement there. Has some biblical undertones to me. Um, Lindsay, you never know what another person is dealing with in their life, and you should interact with others with this in mind. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Sheely, oops, lost that comment there. Okay, so I'm just trying to catch up with some of the comments here. So this is an absolute flood. So actually, I'll take that as a good sign as well. Even though I can't read all these because they're flying by so quickly, but just the this actually was turned out not to be that difficult of an exercise. So these are things that clearly are on your mind. You didn't have to put a lot of thought into. I think initially when I said it, the comments immediately started to flow out of you. So you have, in my mind, my initial impression is here that you have ideas about the way that the world should be, the oughts and the shoulds that are very much ingrained in your ordinary everyday thinking pattern. Um, what I wanted you to really get at with this particular exercise in this poll was to think about normative behavior and our expectations for how people should be. And I didn't want to get too philosophical, but I did want to consider how we got here. Not in the webinar, but what's your take on how humanity like this, these ideas on, how we should treat one another, how do we develop these things? Why is the world the way that it is? And these beliefs that you have, are they associated with a particular religion or faith that you consider yourself to be a part of? Are you grounded in some very distinctive, maybe something more rigid in terms of a scientific framework, or a little bit of both? This is really the essence of culture and the various concepts and ideas that are bound to our identity and our idea of the world and how it should be. So this next question here, this really encapsulates what we already talked about, but it is very flatly put out there. How do other people define your personal culture? And what I thought was interesting, as I was trying to think of different ways to situate argumentation here for this discussion, is like, how does this question hit you? If someone comes up to you and inquires, like, how do you define your personal culture? And this idea of like sensitivity, like how can we be sensitive to one, just that general questions when people want to know what our identity is and how we define it, when we may not have the clearest sense of what that is, and also this feeling that we may not necessarily share values or principles with that person, and that may, lead to some sort of tension in that particular relationship. And also this broader concern about the extent to which we can actually be defined. And this really undergirds this broader philosophy around cultural sensitivity. So I'm going to briefly go through these next slides just to give you a little bit more background on cultural competence. But this is something that was popularized by Dr. Josepha Capina Bacote, who was a psychiatric nurse. And initially, this framework focused on multicultural counseling and some of the unique and distinctive ways that clinicians and diverse people in psychiatry were engaged by one another in this process. So some of these questions that we've discussed, they really form this two-way street that is cultural competence. An interesting note about Dr. Capina Bacote is that she was a Cape Verdean immigrant who settled in Connecticut in the late 1960s. And during this time, she was recognizing that practitioners and individuals receiving treatment often had very incongruent backgrounds, norms, and understandings of simply what health means and what healthy meant. And again, this conversation sort of devolved into this what ought to be and how it ought to be. So again, as we talk about cultural competence and the replacement of this framework with the idea of cultural sensitivity, we're also talking about, something that gets a little bit more into place and time. This idea of like, are you culturally competent or are you striving to become culturally competent? And for us, it's about becoming culturally sensitive, and this humility in recognizing that we can never fully understand all the different facets and contours of culture, but we can work towards that through different processes, which we're going to get a little bit more into here. So this quote from Dr. Capina Bacote I really like. So she says, the process of cultural competence in the delivery of healthcare services is a model that views cultural competence as an ongoing process in which the healthcare provider continuously strives to achieve the ability to effectively work within the cultural context of the client. Again, focusing on these different levels, and I would add organization, but the individual, the family, and the community. So again, here we really care about this process of becoming culturally sensitive. So to return briefly to some of the criticism, we've talked a little bit about this already, but there's been this sense again, you can't become competent in something that is fluid and always changing. And again, there's this rigid focus, and also in consideration of how increasingly diverse this country has been, but is, we're recognizing that it truly is, with greater attention to, again, gender, religion, and other markers or identifiers that people associate with themselves. So this has been a big criticism. And another thing that I think is really interesting is that a lot of times we engage in this process of ethnic glossing, which means we look at one group of people, particularly by the color of their skin. We'll look at one black person who's born and raised in Miami and say this person is the exact same of this other person who's on the outside is black, but they're from Jamaica. Um, and saying that essentially these people have the same culture. So there's this idea that cultural competence historically has imposed this one size fits all model on diversity in conversations about how we engage these populations. So people really do not like, or people in the field and academics typically don't like this idea of competence because it implies this idea of mastery. And I think maybe a gentler way to look at this is to say that competence is just something that's very aspirational. The more cynical take is that it's flat out illusory. So again, with this emergence of cultural competence, there's been some rightful critiques and modifications to the framing. And again, my personal criticism, which we started with, is that I think we can get so bogged down in the semantics of it that we forget the larger arguments about when we simply approach populations of people with a critical and intentional lens, that we're just more effective in the work that we do and we have better outcomes with these populations. Other quick criticisms that I'll run through is that a lot of times with cultural competence, and also could be a criticism of cultural sensitivity, is that we tend to situate this Western biomedicine model as the model, the preeminent model that all different cultures and groups of people should aspire to. And the unfortunate consequence of this is that everything else in terms of medical models get framed as inferior, primal, uninvolved, and ineffective. And the other thing that I want to touch on here is being mindful of this sense that when we talk about cultural competence, and again, I sort of jokingly talked about the buzzwords that I had in the webinar statement, there's this sense that we really have to walk on eggshells and that you're constantly having to submit to irrational or unfounded demands from the individuals that you're working from in practice. So I'm going to argue today that the process of becoming culturally sensitive requires you to break some eggs, and that you can't become culturally sensitive until you've broken some of these eggs and that you've earnestly tried your hand at this. So the question turns to, as we shift into more of a conversation of actual application, is how can we accept our limitations while maintaining a high standard of care and engagement with the individuals that we work with, and also importantly, how do we avoid some of these different extremes? So bringing this all together, cultural sensitivity and to a lesser extent cultural humility combine to acknowledge our inevitable limits and how much we can actually understand, relate to, and respond to individuals from cultures that are different from ours, or even people who are from our own cultures, however we define that. But the question is, how do we really know and define what our limits are? So there's this quote that I like, and this isn't meant to be a riddle. There's a catch 22 here, but cultural sensitivity has been defined by Hook as this ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other oriented. So sort of looking at ourselves as the control, as a paradigm of what things should be, but having this other oriented framework where we're looking at the aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the individuals that we're working with. So quickly here, cultural sensitivity is about being inclusive. It's about being evidence-based, holistic, and strength-based. So inclusive, that's bringing in all the different stakeholders, the employee, the organization, the individual, the family, the community, and it's being evidence-based. And I touched on this earlier, and I feel like this is really important for people who are a little on the fence about cultural sensitivity and these practices in general. We know it's evidence-based. The data that we look at shows it. Focus groups show it. And there's literature going back 10, 15, even more years showing that when we apply these practices, we simply do a better job with these populations. And I'm going to return to that point a few times as we work through this. This cultural sensitivity is holistic in the sense that it means to target the physical, mental, social, and the cultural aspects of health. And it's strength based in the sense that we don't treat culture, we try not to treat the culture of these individuals as an obstacle, but as a source of power and evolution in overcoming some of these structural and systemic challenges that exist. Another thing that I'll emphasize here is that cultural sensitivity is about evolution. It's about being adaptable. So this is recognizing that, again, back to this idea of a one size fits all model not being applicable in this space, that different people relate differently to some of the evidence based paradigms that we try to place on them. So one thing that's I think been particularly salient for me is this conversation, this recent conversation, and this is somewhat superficial, but the conversation around Hispanic versus Latino versus Latinx, and when we're employing these adjectives or these pronouns, just being cognizant of how we're looking at people, how we're approaching their spaces, and how we're listening to what their expectations are. And the other things that I quickly want to emphasize here is that cultural sensitivity is also really about verbal communication. It's what we're saying and how we're saying it. And it's also very much about nonverbal communication, what we're showing physically through body language and such, and how these things sort of intersect to give individuals in recovery and individuals that we're working with perceptions about how we may feel about them. So the flip side of this is looking at what cultural sensitivity is not. So again, it's not just about race and ethnicity. It folds in conversations about gender and sexual orientation and marital status, and just some of the general cultural things that underpin our daily lives and the way that we perceive the world. And also, I really do like to look at cultural sensitivity as not a science, but something that is truly an art or an art form. Also importantly, and I know we have a pretty large group here today, but I hope this is not all frontline practitioners. I hope that we have people from management and who are working at different levels of organizations who can understand that this is not just about people on the front line working one-on-one with individuals in recovery, but it's really a practice that has to be embedded at the organizational level. in terms of the buy-in, in terms of the way that it permeates policies and procedures and attitudes from people in management positions who obviously have a great influence on the practices of the people who they're working with. So other things to quickly emphasize is that it's not a political orientation. Again, and this is back to the idea of like how PC are we being? Are we being too PC? And this outrage culture and where like it's not about perfection. This is really again this process of breaking some eggshells and to a certain extent experimenting through this process of learning and dialogue with the people in our organization and the people that we're working with in practice as individuals in recovery. So this is a good point for me to transition, and then I think we're going to take a break after these slides. But I want to really get into this conversation about expectations, and I really love this quote from Great Expectations, which is a book that was written around 1860 by Charles Dickens. So there's this great quote from one of the characters who says, "Take nothing on its looks, take everything on evidence, and that there is no better rule here." So why do we care about expectations? Because first, we know that there's something missing from our professional and personal interactions, and a lot of times we leave these exchanges with people in various facets of our life, not knowing what is expected of us, or even what we genuinely expect of those people. So whether this is in employer-employee relationships, whether it's in relationships with significant others or individuals that we're engaging who are in recovery. So why is this? And then also, what is the consequence of this dynamic? When we go in with these established expectations for how people think and how they will behave or react, we ultimately have no real sense of what they really need. We have these pre-established expectations. So how often do we tell our supervisor what kind of supervision we prefer, if any at all? Probably not much. How often do we tell a significant other that we prefer to eat at this one restaurant opposed to the other restaurant that they say that they would like to go to before we begrudgingly settle on the one that they wanted to go to? So this is all really wrapped up in this idea of, on a very basic level, we don't like to appear to be quote unquote needy. We also don't want to be misunderstood, and I think more fundamentally, we don't want to be rejected. And the people that we see in practice and that we engage in practice are no different. We don't want to disappoint. They don't want to disappoint as well. And as a result, we're inevitably disappointed, and oftentimes the people we're working with are inevitably disappointed. So expectation setting really is an engine in cultural sensitivity programming for substance use and mental health. And really, again, through these processes, we're often reinforcing the tendencies to not share or to undershare as a result of our own insecurities. Um, so for some reason, in the past couple of weeks, I was thinking about Donald Rumsfeld. Maybe one night I was just up and he popped in my mind for whatever reason, and I thought about this quote that he laid out maybe sometime around 2005, 2006, where he's talking about this existential terrorist threat, and he's in a press conference, and with no sort of remorse or self-reflection, or maybe he was self-reflecting, he had this comment saying that in terms of the threats that are facing the nation, there are known knowns, there are things we know that we know, there are known unknowns, that is to say, there are things that we know we don't know, but then there are also unknown unknowns, and there are things that we do not know we don't know. So in my mind, I saw this. I said, there's a certain poetic brilliance to this, in addition to just the content of the statement. I said, Donald Rumsfeld, like this man is a cultural sensitivity warrior, and this really represents the paradigm. And obviously, I'm saying this somewhat tongue in cheek, but this is really the paradigm that exists in our conversations. I don't think we necessarily think at this high of a level, but we have a variety of blind spots when we're dealing with individuals in recovery and just throughout our personal lives, and not knowing what we need to know, but also not knowing the things that we need to know. And also, I realized what I said there was confusing. But again, just to get more into these expectations, so I can break this down to something that's a little bit more digestible, there's really four interweaving dimensions to this process of expectation settings. And the first two really concern us. And I don't want to overstate this, but simply speaking, in these conversations and these exchanges, oftentimes we simply don't ask the individuals across from us because we don't think to ask. So, on a very basic level, we don't know what to ask, so we don't ask. The other aspect of this is that we don't ask because we're concerned about the response of these individuals. And one I think really salient academic point or scholarly point to bring in here is that much of this is built around this idea of stigma and shame. And there's this sociologist named Thomas Sheff who refers to shame as the master emotion. So think about that for a second. Not fear, not anger, not jealousy, which all could be related to shame, but shame itself as being sort of the genesis of our intense emotionality. So as one generic example of this paradigm that I set up here in terms of the expectation, it's the scenario of entering an intake session with an individual and thinking, I think this person is a male, but because of how they dress or how they speak, I'm not really sure. And I know if I call them a male, they're not. They're going to be mad. I may get mad. I may get some negative feedback from this individual. I might get some negative feedback from a supervisor. I may completely turn this relationship upside down based on this one characteristic or this one trait. So on the flip side of this, the other two dimensions in this dyad are concerning the individual in recovery, and this is the instance of them not telling us because they don't think to tell us, or they don't know how because they have different cognitive or linguistic barriers. Or also they may not tell us because they're concerned about our response. They're concerned about being rejected or being shamed by us. And another generic example, a Jamaican man may be coming in and saying this American woman, emphasizing that, doesn't understand how important it is for a Jamaican man to keep his issues, his mental health issues to himself, and I don't want this person to know what I'm going through. So these are all instances that take place on a micro level that if you amplify on a more macro level, you see some of the different social and psychological constructs that come into play to influence how we interact in these situations. So I think this is probably a good time for us to take a break. Diane, I don't know if you want to do 5 or 10 minutes, um, but hopefully you can take a little time to get yourself coffee or whatever you may need, and reflect a little bit about what we've talked about here, and then we're going to launch into different applications for cultural sensitivity applications. So I'm going to put this on hold, and we'll take a break. Thank you.
We'll meet back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's webinar. Jerel, if you're ready, I'll turn the presentation back over to you.
Perfect. I'm ready. Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome back. So for the second part of this, the last part being the evaluation component, I want to talk about the application of cultural sensitivity practices in a direct manner. So I know, and I would hope that you have something from this webinar that you can take that you actually feel like it's substantive and it's got some weight to it that you can actually employ moving forward. So with that goal in mind, let's get started. So one of my favorite frameworks to use in this space when it comes to application of these principles is this model, which is actually from, again, Dr. Kapina Bakote. So becoming culturally sensitive, again, is really about becoming inquisitive. So in practice, you can use this model. It's called the ACTS model. You can access the individual's expectations by tapping into these different facets here. So the first, corresponding to the A, is cultural awareness. The S, cultural skill. The K, cultural knowledge. The E, cultural encounters. And the D, corresponding to cultural desire. So I'm going to unpack each of these and try to give you a sense of how these relate to the day-to-day implementation of practices along these lines. So just to speak more broadly, there are a lot of routes to applying culturally sensitive procedures, and these really, are going to be dependent on the type of organization that you're working with and the sort of resources that you have at your avail. But there are some core principles here, which is again why I'm using this model, that I think are applicable across any level of organization or institution or any internal sort of hierarchy that may be in place that otherwise you may not think would be conducive to this sort of modality. So starting off with the first, and a lot of these are very intuitive, so I'm not going to overstate them or try to make them seem more sophisticated than they are. But I like that these are very practical, and I feel like these are going to tap into things that feel very intuitive to you. So the first in the ACTS model is cultural awareness. So cultural awareness relates to this understanding that people have different behaviors and worldviews. And with this, these behaviors, these worldviews, they relate to coping styles, which are ultimately informed by their culture and by their biology. Another key component of cultural awareness relates to examining your own prejudices and biases. And also through this process, not just the recognition of what these are, but trying to identify where they come from and if there are some cultural roots. So this gets to the question of why. Why do I have these particular prejudices and biases? And also understanding, this is back to the anecdote that I delivered a little bit earlier when we started, is to what extent do these prejudices and biases, which I believe we all do have, how do they impact your attitudes and behaviors with people and to the people that you're working with in treatment? So what I recognize here, and I've had this conversation many times before, is that when you're examining your own prejudices and biases, it's an uncomfortable process, but I feel like it's a very necessary one. And I also don't think that it needs to necessarily undercut the dynamic that you're trying to establish as somebody who's culturally sensitive. So just rattling off, one particular framework for you to think within is like coming into this process or coming into this webinar, just thinking about, do you have or did you ever have certain opinions about people who consume alcohol or drugs? Similarly, did you ever have any particular perspectives about people who have mental illness and thinking about like, what were the roots of that? Like, why do they drink or why do they drink so much? Why do they use drugs? Why do they use these particular type of drugs? Why do they snort? Why do they inject? Just thinking about the different facets and some of the different value statements that you may project onto those types of activities. And just sort of internally note these things and examine them internally as we go through some of these upcoming slides, because all these different facets of the ACTS model, they're really interconnected. So one table that I found here as I was doing a little bit of a literature search, which I thought was really interesting. So I haven't given you a ton of background about where I'm from and just some of the work that I've done, but I've been involved pretty intimately in research on mental illness and in particular these individuals as coming from racial and ethnic minority groups and looking at like different attitudes around them and the different experiences that they had. So I've been in particular interested about this idea of stigma. So I found this research that was done from the General Social Surveys, which is a pretty large survey. And although this data is a little bit old, and oftentimes the data unfortunately is a little bit old, it's always in arrears, just sort of a outgrowth of our inability to be really data driven when it comes to science and research. But I thought this was really interesting. So hopefully you can see this somewhat well, and I'm happy to amplify this and send this out separately. But there are some very, I guess, not surprising, but still dramatic trends that can be observed in looking at this. So if you look at some of if you look at the horizontal axis here, you see the percent of people who would be unwilling to move next door to, make friends with, spending evening with, socializing, work closely with on a job or marry into your family, people with who are deemed troubled or who have depression or schizophrenia. So if you look at these, some of these numbers are pretty staggering. I'll just pluck out a few of these, and you're more than welcome to pluck out ones that seem salient to you. But the number of people who are unwilling to move next door to a person with schizophrenia is 37%. That goes up by 8% for the number of people who are unwilling to move next door to somebody who has what they term alcohol dependence. The number of people who are unwilling to make friends with somebody who has a drug dependence is 59.1%. This is a majority of a representative sample of people. So these are pretty staggering numbers. I won't go through all these, but this gives you a snapshot of sort of what we're competing with when it comes to adjusting expectations and sort of working through and navigating just different attitudes that exist out there among the general population. So, how do we understand how we fit into this narrative, and what is our role, again, in navigating and adjusting some of these perspectives? And how do we acknowledge that even if we don't feel this way, that our colleagues might, or that our organizations are not designed and constructed in such a way to sort of combat and address these attitudes? And also keeping in mind when we're thinking about the individuals that we work with on that one-to-one basis and thinking about their lives outside of our clinics, what if they have a landlord who holds, perceptions like this, or if their employer is like this, or people within their own family? Like, how do we combat this? How do we situate this in a way where we can actually have an impact? So the next part of the model that I want to discuss is cultural skill, and I think this one is also pretty intuitive, but this is our process of collecting relevant cultural details about an individual's history and their presenting problems. And we're going to get a little bit more into this as we talk about assessment later on. But these different cultural details get into the individual's beliefs, values, and behaviors in relation to health, and also more generally in relation to their worldviews and how different actors and people in their lives and outside of their lives interact and what their perceptions are of these individuals. So this component of skill relates to our ability to really successfully and effectively collect these details about the individual's context, and for us to really think about the different forces and factors in the lives of these individuals that might curb or weaken their desire to express who they are and why they engage in certain behaviors or why they hold certain views. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Cultural knowledge, and again, these really truly are interwoven, is this process of seeking and obtaining information about diverse groups. This is where we get a little bit more methodical in looking at the literature and looking at the evidence-based research that's out there to understand right now today, like, what are some of these health-related beliefs and values that exist in these populations? What are the trends in disease or disorder in these populations? And also, what do we really know about treatment efficacy given some of these cultural and social complexities that exist? So one really interesting case study that I've thought would be valuable for us to raise would be a condition that you probably have heard about, which is ataque de nervios. So this is a pretty common condition that's characterized clinically by what are referred to as intense emotional episodes, anger, and disassociation, which often but not always presents in people from Caribbean origins. Some more recent estimates have suggested that up to 15% of Puerto Ricans may experience this. And this quote from Guarnacia, I think, is really interesting. So, the ataque is an expression of anger and grief resulting from the disruption of family systems, the process of migration, and concerns about family members and people's countries of origin. So, this is really salient and interesting for a few reasons. One is that this is very much culturally embedded. This is not a statement that talks about biochemical pathways and genetics and things along those lines, which are often highly medicalized. This is an instance of relating the intersection between culture and health. And what is interesting, what I just alluded to there, is that this is a process of medicalization. And I don't look at that as a bad thing, but this is a move in the field of medicine and social work to say we need to legitimize what many have already recognized as being considerable. And if any of you are familiar with the history of this, this is a condition that started off as something that was very gendered. So this is something where it's like, these are nervous and frantic and unstable women. And, through this broader conversation and sort of hearing testimony from Puerto Ricans and, family members and individuals who are working through the condition, we realize that it's a very rich and culturally steeped condition. So we begin to ask, like, how can we quantify or define a condition that seems so culturally bounded? So we know that ataque de nervios exists. In the U.S. culture, we talk a lot about panic attacks and anxiety disorders. So why have we delegitimized ataque de nervios? So we know we see the symptoms, but because it didn't neatly fit into this Western biomedicine binary, the conditions associated with this have been historically devalued, marginalized clinically and on a cultural level. So we've had this really myopic view of what disease is, and we've also had a very myopic view of who has the power and legitimacy to say this is an actual condition that we should pay attention to. And there are very dramatic consequences of a framework like that. So moving ahead into the fourth dimension of the ACT model is cultural encounters, and this also is very intuitive. So many of you are already directly working with people who are coming from culturally diverse backgrounds, and as far as I'm concerned, I would love to see people define this as broadly or narrowly as they think is appropriate. But cultural encounters really gets us this idea of how do we engage in this cross-cultural exchange and interaction with individuals from these diverse backgrounds. And also, it's us stepping back and recognizing that everything that we're reading in books, that we're seeing in emails from our leaders, do not necessarily reflect what an actual encounter is like. It does not necessarily reflect the lived experience. So this is really something that's very practical and grounded and experiential. So we learn from direct experience. And our capacity to understand and engage the diversity of people we work with is very much enhanced by these direct encounters. And this is straightforward enough, but the point here is that we should always be seeking out these experiences to learn and to develop experience through these one-on-one encounters and not shy away from it. So the last one here is a little more nebulous. This gets to something that I feel like is very, very much intrinsic, but this idea that we have to have a cultural desire to be culturally sensitive in order to be culturally sensitive. So this is a process of developing this internalized want to work with culturally diverse individuals in recovery. And it's very hard to talk to somebody who doesn't, maybe, inherently have this or innately have this trait and say, like, you should care. So I think there's a few different approaches to this, and I think one is just sort of the acknowledgement of the very practical aspects of this. Like humanistically, we just like to go out and say like you should care because you should care about people. I think the more practical and perhaps savvy route is to say again, this is evidence based, and we know that this works. I would like to think in terms of sustainability, though, that you can tap into the extrinsic side to say, we're going to do cultural sensitivity training. If you do it, you're going to get these continuing education credits, or you're going to get extra pay, or you're going to get overtime, or whatever bait has to be put out there to get people to be interested in this on a surface level. But I'm arguing that in order for this really to hold and for this to be meaningful, that we really have to tap into some intrinsic desire. We really do have to care. We have to deepen a desire to care and to work with these populations. And it's not a coincidence that through this process, we're required to acknowledge our gaps in awareness, knowledge, skills, and encounters or experiences. So I have another painting here, and I actually really like this one. This one is Picasso. So you may be more familiar with Picasso than the paintings that I presented from Velasquez. But this is a painting that's associated with the Expressionist movement, and came out right around the early 1900s, in 1901. So the same sort of exercise here, I would love for you to take a look at this painting and pluck out, don't worry about number three here again in the interest of time, but just think about three interesting things that are happening in this painting, and also think about what Picasso might be saying here, if anything. And really, again, I would like you to approach this however you want to approach it. Don't think about what my approach might be or what your colleagues might be, but like as you look at this, what's happening in the picture? Again, you can focus on color and lighting, perspective, and some of those other things that are a little pretentious. Or you can look at the position of the characters, their actions, and their activities. You could focus on race and ethnicity. Do they fall into the gender binary? What's their mood? I don't want to plant too many seeds, but I really do want you to think, in light of the model that we just presented, like if you encounter a person like this, like what's going to be your perception of who they are, where they're coming from, and how you might be able to engage them in some of the processes that we're tasked to engage individuals in. So again, I'm going to give a minute here for you to think through this, and I'm going to put this up. So please respond again in the Q&A box or the chat box. So again, we have some absolutely wonderful responses here, and I see we've definitely got some art critics in the house. Michelle Paisley, her hands are quite large. She appears to be in deep thought, wondering. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of lag here with the comments. I'm just trying to parse through some of these. Dana Collier, this is a pretty interesting kind. Considering absence, she could be reflecting on whether or not this is poison. That's a very interesting idea. Sherry Lard's hands neat updo of her hair, but with some tendrils dangling down. Michelle Rodriguez, her hand seems like she is thinking. Should I be, but I better not. Interesting. Christina, deep in thought. I want to know what she is thinking. What is so interesting about that glass and figure? Sabrina, color, depression, anxiety, stress. Santina, very short and to the point. Doubt. Crystal, debating, wondering. Mary, subject appears to be in distress and contemplative of drinking, implies there is a problem with alcohol. So again, these are all wonderful comments, and I'm glad that you're really starting to tap into in wrestling. I think with the subjective aspects of this, and then the aspects that seem maybe a little bit more objectively clear. So as a bar here, this actually is a painting of a friend of Picasso, fellow painter Angel Fernandez de Soto. And another funny thing that I don't even know how I came up with this code or where I found this, but I was just randomly looking to see what other feedback was online, and someone said this. Um, Cartoon characters. This was a criticism. Cartoon characters painted with all the control, grace, subtlety, and flair of an 8-year-old scrawling a dirty picture on a classroom chalkboard. So perspective here. But these are all wonderful comments. I'm really appreciating that you're engaging with this process of reflection. I think also, thinking, trying to get inside of this person's head, but also thinking if you were in this situation, how you might react and how you might respond. And this idea of reflexivity is really critical to this overall conversation about being invested and being embedded in this world of cultural sensitivity. So some of the take-home points here that I want to emphasize is that we really want to be fluid in this process of teasing out specific social, cultural, and environmental factors that contribute to a person's beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. And we want to understand how these factors ultimately contribute to ongoing challenges and barriers to prevention, treatment, and recovery. Another interesting way to look at this is like we all understand this idea of risk factors, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but we care about these dimensions. We care about objectivity and subjectivity and reflexivity because we want to put ourselves in a position to reverse engineer some of these risk factors into a productive and equitable relationship with the individuals that we're working with. So this is a quote that I really like that is short and to the point. Culture is a way of coping with the world by defining it in detail. Malcolm Bradbury. So through the ACT model, we can really begin to map out approaches to successfully engaging the individuals that we work with in prevention and substance use and mental health programming that we have. So as we discuss this process, I want you to just continue to I'm not going to do a formal poll, but I'd like you to just continue to take an inventory of the kinds of diversity that you encounter in your everyday life. Think about the sort of people that you encounter in practice every day. Think about the people that you encounter outside of practice on a daily basis at the church, at the gym, at the grocery store. And think about this. What are the intersections between these two groups? The reason why this consideration is important because in general we're all falling into very specific and tightly controlled, often tightly controlled social networks. And when I talk about social networks, I don't mean necessarily platforms like Twitter and Facebook, although those do embody this, but I mean just in your everyday physical life, the people who are part of your world. One thing that we know from research and even, I guess, our casual observations, and I think all of you will agree with this, a lot of times our networks are comprised of people who are like us. They're often the same race or ethnicity, they're in the same general age range or level of education. They have kids. If we don't have kids, they don't have kids. And this process, this dynamic is called homophily. And basically, this is this movement towards being associated with and around people and socializing with people who are similar to us on some of these surface level characteristics. And what's important here is that in order for us to stay in these networks, we have to do certain things. We have to learn to do certain things to stay in these networks, to be a part of them, to feel involved and to feel a sense of belonging. So, as practitioners, which I already sort of alluded to here, um, these networks are important because people's beliefs, their ideas, and their behaviors, they tend to generally be accepted, tolerated, or reinforced. So as a result, when you're a part of these networks, there's a tendency to do things to belong and to maintain membership in these groups. So this is a crude model. I'm not going to get too much into this, but I'm really, really, really big fan of social network analysis and research. But in a model like this, and you look at the different connections between the people here. So you've got Oscar, who apparently, if you look at this as a friendship network, he has two friends, which, it's not bad. He's got Dave, he's got Alice. If you look at Alice, she has Oscar and Dave and Carlos. If you look at Carlos, Carlos is doing pretty well. Carlos has got a lot of friends. He's got a lot of things going on in his life. He's got Alice, he's got Bob, he's got Eve, and he's got Amothep. So again, why do we care about these different associations, and particularly when we want to look in the context of Florida and how we apply cultural sensitive practices in these spaces? We know some very important things about the demographic makeup of the state. So one, Florida is huge. There's around 21 million people there with a mix of urban, rural, and suburban ecologies. We also know that the state is very diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, and linguistic, or languages that are spoken there. So I'm not going to go through the statistics here because you're all probably very intimately familiar with that. But ultimately, Florida is a place that's unique and it enjoys a lot of richness in the density of this diversity. It also has one of the largest concentrations of immigrants in the world. Also worth noting is diversity in terms of the adults that identify as non-religious. So back to our conversation about beliefs. You've got a quarter of the population that defines themselves as non-religious. You also have a population that's older. So when you're looking at sort of intergenerational dynamics that are going to be associated with patterns of usage of certain substances or their approaches to dealing with mental health issues, you're going to find some disparities there. And increasingly, we're recognizing the emergence of people who feel more comfortable identifying as transgender. So, what can we forecast as ways to deal with these populations that have historically been underrepresented in our conversations here? So, why this is really important is because we know that there are health disparities embedded in almost every nook and cranny of the healthcare system. And in particular, we know that certain mental health conditions and use of certain substances is much higher among individuals with certain traits. And what this means in a place like Florida is that we're more likely to see patients with these particular traits, or certain type of patients are going to have certain type of traits, and we call these surface structures. So this does not necessarily tell us who these people are, but this tells us what they may do. It tells us the people that they may be around and the sort of social forces that may enable the different practices that they engage in, which may be maladaptive to their health. So I spent some time a few weeks ago just sort of looking at some of the different periodicals in Florida. And, this is not specific to Florida. This is a nationwide thing. And again, I didn't want to get into semantics and language and the debate about, like, do we call people addicts? That was not the purpose of this conversation today. Or, do we call them abusers? Or, if a person in recovery refers to themselves as an addict, like, do we check them on that and say, actually, you know what? I read this paper and you're not supposed to call yourself that. Like, obviously that's totally inappropriate. But what it this exercise was instructive to me because it presented this landscape of dialogue and narrative around what this population is and sort of like how we frame them in the broader conversation about what our culture and what our society is, particularly in Florida. So again, why we care about these details and why we care about networks is because we know that certain conditions that we care about that we're dealing with on a daily basis in practice, we know that they're more prevalent among particular subgroups or demographic subgroups and their networks. And this gives us an opportunity to target and tailor our resources to these individuals. And these are deep structures, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So a few more data before we do it. These things are probably readily clear. This uses some older data, but I found that this was very relevant because one, these trends have more or less maintained in the past 5 years since this survey was done. But right off the bat, and you would think, okay, 1 or 2 percentage points, like that's not that big of a deal. But this was a survey of adults who had reported poor mental health um, greater than 14 of the past 30 days in Florida by race and ethnicity. So right here you see some pretty clear disparities. Non-Hispanic blacks clocking in at 13.6% compared to 11.6 among non-Hispanic whites, and Hispanics being 0.3% above the non-Hispanic white in terms of this reporting. So although these appear statistically to be insignificant or maybe even blips in the data, on a clinical level, they're significant, and they demonstrate trends that we should pay attention to and to be mindful to. So the next thing that I want to briefly present, and again, I want to be mindful of time. And sorry, I apologize. I think this is going to be a little bit easier to read. But the funny thing with data is like when you're using bar graphs, you can see the trends pretty clearly. So hopefully, what you're observing here is that there's some gender disparities when it comes to prescription drugs usage among middle school students without a doctor's prescription. Also looking at some of the other data here, other disparities along the lines of gender and race and ethnicity in figure 6 here for medical students who ever took over the counter drugs to get high. So this is just one small sampling of what is a much larger story about differences in groups and cultures along the lines of culture in terms of usages and engagement with treatment. So another one, I'm really going to, again, just emphasize the same thing. Just looking at these bars, you can see that there's some clear disparities. And again, I think there'd be, a knee-jerk reaction to look at this and say, oh, it's just 1 or 2%. But this manifest, given how large Florida is, this actually translates into a pretty significant disparity. And again, this signals us to the fact that there are likely different cultural, social, or economic forces that are contributing to these disparities, all other things being considered. So now that we've talked about some of these different kind of traits and features that typify people that we interact with in practice, I want to talk more about specific tailoring approaches. And this segment was a little bit more difficult because there's such a broad spectrum. And, I've articulated from the beginning that there's no one size fits all model. So it's, a bit of a contradiction for me then to go and say, okay, well, here go 5 things that you can do. Definitely, like no doubt, you could try these things and they're definitely going to work. So I don't want to do that. But what I do want to do is talk a little bit about some of my prior experience. Diane earlier introduced my stint at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. So I want to talk about some specific work that we did there in tailoring our resources for a very specific and a very vulnerable population of people with serious mental illness in Washington Heights and Harlem, these being communities on the northern, or I guess you could say the northern half of Manhattan. So our Center of Excellence for Cultural Competence was established in the early 2000s through the New York State Office of Mental Health, and our key foci there were examining mental and physical health. And we had a big focus on physical health, and I'll explain why, for racial and ethnic minorities with serious mental illness. And again, we're focusing on these areas with high concentrations of Black, Puerto Rican, and Dominican individuals. And in our case, this was particularly Harlem, Washington Heights, and also there's another community called Inwood where we observe some of these challenges. So there were two motivations. One was very much clinical. So our mandate is like we're recognizing that individuals in the U.S. with serious mental illness have much higher rates of chronic disease. So this is things like obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. And we're recognizing that their mortality rates are much higher and that they're dying much sooner, not just with people in the general population, but these people, they're dying sooner. Blacks and Hispanics with serious mental illness are dying sooner than even whites with serious mental illness. So our research motivation here was to look at different interventions, lifestyle interventions focused on exercise and nutrition to try to understand what is being done in the field. And keep in mind, this research was done in 2010. So we're trying to understand what is being done to improve the physical health of this population and why are we neglecting this? So what emerged out of this was this literature review that we published in 2010 in a journal called Psychiatric Services. And what we found is that, one, there's not a lot of research on this vulnerable subgroup of racial and ethnic minorities with serious mental illness. And then what we learned is that this research, which was already very limited, was not looking at specific concerns or was not addressing the cultural expectations of this population. So yeah, they're intervening to improve the general health, but they're not considering the role of race and ethnicity or understanding how these cultures impacted the health attitudes and behaviors of this population. So yes, the clinicians, the interventionists, they're looking at, let's get these populations lower fat and lower calorie food options, and let's focus on portion control, but we're not really looking at cultural adaptations. So we're not recognizing that, something like rice is a very important dish for a lot of cultures, Hispanic, Black, and otherwise. So we're not recognizing that, just looking at the comments that were submitted here during the Q&A, that people have a very high premium on food as this unifying cultural force. So how do you develop an intervention and say we're going to remove rice or we're going to remove foods that we know are saturated in fats and calories? Like how do we sort of find that middle ground to meet the needs of these populations? And another interesting thing with this intervention is that we found that we also had an environmental issue here. So a lot of times in this work, we're thinking strictly it's all the individual. It's about what they're not doing. Black people have the capacity to not, cook their food in lard or what have you. Like they can do that. But also beyond getting the individual level, we're not really paying attention to the environmental forces. So one thing that we found as we're digging deeper into our research, and this is the next paper that emerged out of this that I wrote, and I think this one came out in 2013, is as we started to speak to different stakeholders, so speaking to physicians and social workers who are working with this population, we learned how does our population even begin to engage in something like exercise when there's no walkability here, when our sidewalks have gaps and cracks in them, when it may not be particularly safe for them to walk. We have, drivers who are not particularly attentive of pedestrians, and also this issue of we have limited grocery stores, and the grocery stores that we have, they sell, apples from 6 months ago, that are still on the shelf. So how can we target these individual level factors when we have all these community level barriers? So tailoring is really about shaping and molding practices around these different nuances. And for us, it was recognizing that we have to meet, and this is very cliche, but it's very true, that we have to meet culturally, racially, ethnically diverse populations where they're at. and we have to find those middle grounds in order to be effective in what we're doing with them. So again, I did not want to come up with a very exhaustive list of cultural tailoring techniques, and instead want to focus on some of these umbrella issues and some of the larger overarching constructs behind tailoring. But just to give you a sense, and these are things that I think you're all familiar with, but one process that I think is important in cultural tailoring is just thinking about how do we inquire about consistently about a person's understanding of their usage and treatment efficacy during our interactions with them. So questions like, how do you describe your usage, or how do you describe your health? What would success in treatment look like to you? And also us consistently asking about the compositions of these networks. Who are their family? Who are their friends? Who are the people who are providing these instrumental levels of support? Who also, for us, selfishly, can we tap into as allies as this process of working people through the recovery process? So again, there's an endless library of tailoring techniques that we can draw from, but at a very basic level, we want to start with these very intentional questions where we're trying to understand and set expectations. So again, and I don't want to harp on this, but other tailoring techniques in this space, which get a little bit more contentious, are when we're talking about the labels, we're talking about pronouns, and what I would argue and suggest, and this is based on my experience and experience from colleagues, is that these are labels that need to be used in conjunction with the individual. Because a lot of times we'll make suggestions about, again, drawing from the literature that we read, or these statements that come out at 8 a.m. from the morning from the supervisor that says, hey, now we're going to use this because this literature review came out and says that this is most salient. I think it's very important that we establish expectations and norms very early on in these conversations about what people want to be called and how they want to be framed, to understand how they identify and how we can sort of work around what those standards are. Labeling is inherently contentious. And also, as I'm, really trying to articulate here, it can backfire, and it can create a power imbalance where the individual is not still empowered to tell you, actually, I prefer to be called Hispanic instead of Latinx. But you have to be mindful of these things, and the only way to do it is to have those conversations, is to be comfortable enough to have those conversations. There's also, the more vanilla things that can be done, having the translator available and making sure the materials and forms are translated in different languages. And where possible, and this isn't always possible, but trying to match your providers and with the individuals in recovery along the lines of cultural features. So whether you're doing that by gender or gender identification or race or ethnicity, typically these are approaches that are going to bring a little bit more alignment between the backgrounds of these individuals. But this is not always essential. It's not always feasible. And I argue that it's not always essential, again, if you're just setting those baseline expectations and you're being honest and coming in saying, here are my limitations. Let's talk about how these are going to impact the interface that we have moving forward. So briefly, I want to go through another exercise, and we're not going to do a poll for this, but you're welcome to throw in questions if you want to share these with your peers here. But, an individual comes in to you looking for some support in relation to substance use and mental health treatment. How do you ensure that you're engaging this person with cultural sensitivity? So this is like objectively a hip individual who's coming in right now. But thinking back to the framework that we've established, how are you going to ensure that you're engaging this person with cultural sensitivity? What's the first thing that you do here using the cultural sensitivity model? That awareness, the existing skills, the knowledge, the exposure, the desire. How do we incorporate these things into our plans? So first, we want to consider some of these surface structures. Do you know how they identify by race? Have you asked them about that? How about their ethnicity? How do they identify by gender? How about their preferred language? What is that? What about their religion? And also equally important, because we talked about the importance of social networks and pulling people from these social networks as allies. It's this engaging in this conversation around who's in your life, how important are they, and like how, if at all, do you see them factoring into your treatment plan, into your recovery process. And also, I think this is important to know because you can identify people who are not necessarily, one, going to be supportive or who may, in fact, be entirely antithetical to what you're trying to do on that treatment plan. And getting more into some of these deep structures, thinking about the different cultural factors. What do they believe has contributed to the usage or condition? Well, I saw some great responses here from you all about your worldview in terms of like, do you believe in chance? Do you believe in bad luck? Do you believe that, different things that happen to you? I have depression because I did something wrong at some point in my life. I treated this person poorly, and now this is a punishment from God. This is coming from a higher power. So you have a spiritual or religious justification for that. Or also a lot of times, and I feel like, again, there could be overlap between these factors, but a lot of times it's, there's some unique social, cultural, political, and economic pressures that are contributing to the situation that I'm in. But again, you're thinking about the directionality. You're having a conversation to say, what do you think? It's not our role to go on there to say, this is your experience because I've read about this or because 15 other people that I talked to in the last 10 months have had this experience. So I'm going to apply this model on you. So I think for us, and especially people in treatment, like this idea of causation, how did I get here? It can get very, very deep and very, very slippery. And there's a lot of logic mishmashing that takes place here because we can't really determine why we're in this particular predicament. But having that very intentional discussion, you can start to unpack the reasoning that the individual has for why they're in their particular situation that they're in. So again, and I'm wrapping up here, we're thinking about how these cultural factors, these deep structures impact the response of the individual to treatment and how they're defining success. So this is also really important because this is going to get more into your role and how instrumental you are as a person on the other side of this exchange. So wondering or asking them, like, do you believe that clinical providers or people in practice have your best interest in mind? Do you trust them? Why or why not? Thinking about this idea of cultural health capital. This is actually, I think, very salient. I love this concept, but it's this idea that when we enter into a clinical office, so when we go to primary care, we walk in there with sometimes cultural health baggage, or we walk in there with cultural health capital. And this is all about the clinician's perception of like who we are and our deservingness. Like, does this person deserve my time? And a lot of time, and I've heard this in a lot of interviews that I've done. I've done hundreds of interviews over the years with people in treatment and with providers, and a lot of times you hear clinicians say things like, I see this person come in all times for the same thing. And they don't do what I tell them to do. It's very frustrating to me. So in a case like this person is walking in to the office with very low cultural health capital. This clinician has delegitimized them, they've devalued their care, and that, probably stands to reason that they're not going to be putting together the maximum effort to address the issues that this person has, or the sort of troubles that they're working through. So to tie everything together, I want to talk briefly about how we evaluate cultural sensitivity programming. So there are three interlinked components here. The first being, again, understanding an individual in recovery's standards, expectations, and goals, as well as ours, and looking at the intersections between those two. And also thinking in a data-driven way, how do you actually assess and measure those standards, expectations, and goals? And then it's a process of putting together the pre and post tracking. So where were you at when you came into the office, and where you at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, and looking at assessment and measurement of these standards, expectations, and goals. So the first part of this process is thinking about how the individual describes their prior health. What sort of experiences have they had in the past with the healthcare system or with the social welfare system? Have they been negative? Have they been positive? Why or why not? Being cognizant of the different things that you can do to make sure that you're not feeding into their perceptions of what this experience is like or what it's going to be like. Also looking at their current health and how, to what extent this links to their perception of their prior health. And then also, again, thinking very intuitively about their experiences with people in that healthcare social work environment. And again, to an earlier point, like this truly is not cultural sensitivity. It's not a modality for people on quote unquote the front lines. This is leaders. This is office staff, which oftentimes are the first line of interface and engagement for people who are coming into our practice. So having these individuals trained to understand when they're coming in, they're already coming in oftentimes at that cultural health deficit. And what do we do to try to establish that equity and that equality right up front with the front desk staff, with the billing staff, with people who are doing intake, in addition to the people who are providing direct service and the individuals who are crafting the policies and managing schedules and what's said. How do we set that appropriate tone? So I have just a few more minutes here. So what I would like to do is just talk about some of the basic structures that are in place for us to measure our effectiveness in these spaces. So the best tools, or what the best tools have in common, is an honest and systematic assessment of the individual practitioner's performance, reflection, and performance at the organizational level. And I would argue, most importantly, or at least equally importantly, is experiencing the satisfaction of the individual in treatment. So I've outlined some different tools here, and I would love to send these out afterwards if people are interested. And these are just, 5 of hundreds that exist out there. I plucked out these ones because these are regarded as evidence-based tools that are recommended by SAMHSA. So they've been vetted over the years. They have a certain level of statistical validity, so we can operate with a certain level of confidence knowing that these are measuring what we want them to measure. So again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to run through these. This first scale from the ethnic sensitive inventory is tasked at getting you to think about how to measure your own cultural sensitivity. So this one, in working with individuals, and it gives you these 5 options. Do you consider an obligation to familiarize yourself with their culture, history, and other ethnically related responses to problems, etc.? So these are all things that are sort of evaluating and measuring the extent to which you are actually familiar with and developing knowledge and awareness of this person's background, and also being sensitive to any fears that they might have about being discriminated against. So this second part does the similar sort of thing here. In terms of measuring the cultural sensitivity of organizations, and I like this one because this also I think is just to the point that these practices really need to be embedded at the organizational level. A lot of the questions in this scale, the multiculturally competent service system assessment guide, gets at what is your organization actually accomplished? Are you just, again, shooting out those emails to say, we've got this webinar today about this, or are you actually engaging in very intentional conversations with staff to say, here goes the framework for doing this, and then here's how we're going to implement it, and here's how we're going to do it in concrete ways. These questions here, they get at that and give you that opportunity to really measure the extent to which you're going from the point A of establishing these programs to actually being effective and how you're doing it at an organizational level. And the last component here that I'll tap into is measuring the satisfaction of individuals in recovery. So asking them, to what extent do they feel like the staff understands the importance of their cultural beliefs, and to what extent do they understand the differences between their culture, and their culture being the individual, and yours, the mind, being the practitioner. And the second set of questions is pretty similar here. So I'm just going to return briefly to this, and then I'm going to wrap up. So back to this painting that I introduced early on. I don't consider myself to be an art connoisseur by any means, but there were a few things that stuck out to me, and they stuck out to me on a couple of levels. So one was the context of the painting, and the other was the content. So the context is that this was painted almost 400 years ago. So obviously, none of us were around then. Um, to me, it seemed like Velasquez, and being somewhat familiar with his portfolio of work, he recognized the social dimension of substances, and a lot of the Q&A comments that were received, there was a lot of discussion about like bonding and the interactions here. So we see the social importance. So 400 years ago, this was painted in Madrid. It's a place that I've never been into. We see that there's some intergenerational component here. We see that this idea of like culture and social and the intersection and interaction with health has been very salient and important for a very long period of time. On the content end, I was just very interested in the subject. It's a group of people who are gathered around enjoying wine. We talked about Dionysus, who is this Greek god in the center here, who's sort of a focal point. But you also have some smiling faces. You have some people who seem a little downtrodden. It's a little hard to gauge, like what is this god's role in this particular case? Because not everybody here appears to be happy, at least to me. So again, it's the objectivity, it's the subjectivity that go into our perceptions of what's happening. And again, returning to that point that what we're doing here is not a science, but it's truly an art. And to some extent, we need to try to work and mold ourselves into being art connoisseurs when we're working with individuals in practice. So, in closing here, cultural awareness is really central to just recognizing our own biases and our prejudices against cultures that are different from ours. Recognizing when it comes to skill, do we have the skills to do a culturally based assessment? Are we listening with earnesty and interest to the different beliefs and practices in this individual's culture? When it comes to knowledge, building upon this cultural skill, are we really considering the instrumental role of substance use and mental health, or discussions about mental health and how these align or don't align with a particular set of values that this individual has? Coming to these encounters, again, I believe is essential, and I think we all agree, you only really learn about the experience and the nature of these interactions when you've actually put yourself in the situation to have these engagements. So I think it's really critical that we challenge ourselves to the extent that is possible to work with people from different cultures, even though we know it's going to require us to be very self-reflective and to engage in some uncomfortable processes of reconciling different biases and prejudices that we may have. And then again, to this more nebulous point about developing the desire, in all careers, we have extrinsic and intrinsic reasons for doing what we do. When it's extrinsic, a lot of times it's about money and it's about professional development. Ideally, we're tapping more into the intrinsic reasons, but again, in my mind, there's no clear way to make somebody care about being culturally competent or culturally sensitive or culturally humble. But I believe through the process of exposure, that we get closer to that goal, which again is why we focus on not being culturally competent, so we focus on becoming and working towards this space and recognizing that this really is a lifelong process. So just to summarize, cultural sensitivity truly is a two-way street, and it requires inputs and outputs from you, the individual, the network, and the organization. And I believe it's essential to be inquisitive and to set expectations to guide your practices, your assessments, and then the different refinements and adjustments that you make. And also just being very open, and this is the point about equity, being open to self-reflection and to people inquiring about you and who you are and what you're bringing to the table. And then lastly, again, back to this point about expectation, recognizing that these are naturally fluid and that they change, and to try to avoid the one-size-fits-all model. So even with the AXT model, like 10 years from now, this may not be particularly salient. And it's certainly not salient with all levels or subgroups or subpopulations of people that we're working with. But to have a framework to sort of embed yourself in, to sort of couch your practices in, I think is very helpful to keep you grounded so you have some sort of guideline for working with individuals. So with that, I'm going to close. I apologize. I'm a few minutes over here. But I very much enjoyed talking about this topic today. I hope that you learned, at least from my perspective, how important cultural sensitivity is, and that even if you're not quite bought into the particular tailoring strategies, that you do understand that there's an argument to be made that's sort of codified by the literature and research that this really does work, that this improves outcomes among our patients, and that it makes us better practitioners. It makes us better at what we do. I have a few references here that I'm happy to share, and I know that this is going to be posted online, but otherwise, again, I really appreciate your time, and I thank you for being involved today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerel. We just thank you for your time and for your expertise on today's webinar. So when we conclude today's webinar, your browser will take you to an evaluation on FADA's new website. If you want to receive CE credits or a statement of credit for this event, please complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You may consider using the same email address when you register for webinars through our WebEx link and when you set up your profile in FADA's system. This helps connect your attendees and your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today in about 30 minutes. The sender will be Messenger at WebEx. Evaluation will close at midnight on Monday, March 11th. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank especially the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day, and please hold for the evaluation.